Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Rip Rapson from the Kresge Foundation. Let me say that I have a rule of not speaking publicly in front of heroes, and so I really need to sit down right away because between Angela Blackwell, whom you'll hear from during the course of the conference, and John Powell, you have two of my great heroes. I've been in the work of cities and urban revitalization for the better part of 30 years, and as long as I've been as part of that work, Angela and John have been the folks that everyone I know looks up to. Now I have to add to that Tom, so I've got three people I can't talk in front of. And I'm also sort of tempted, only for about a nanosecond, to go through some of the issues and the principles that Tom articulated, because I think it's fair to say that I would stipulate to the correctness of each and every one of them. But I think as they actually land in this context of Detroit here and now, I think they take on a slightly different quality. And so what I want to do very briefly in the minutes I have is talk in a very sort of practical way about the context we find ourselves in. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that I think some of you will already know. I'll talk about it in a way that's, I think, very sort of pragmatic and in the here and now. But I'm hoping that in doing that, we'll not only get a better sense of what that context is, but also, I think, begin to embellish on some of the themes that Professor Segru noted. So let me start by suggesting that the context we find ourselves in now, of course, traces back to the 50s, to the 60s, to the 70s, but it also traces back to some fairly recent history. After I came to the Kresge Foundation in 2006, Mayor Kilpatrick was overseeing a time, I think, of tremendous optimism in this city with all of the issues and the struggles that we knew. But then, of course, 2007, 2008, the floor collapsed underneath us. We had the financial crisis, we had the mayor's personal problems, and we had the terrible devastation of the foreclosure crisis. And it was about that time that I got a call from the newly inaugurated president's office, and President Obama's staff called and said, look, we are not going to permit the city of Detroit to become our Katrina. What is it that we can do? How is it we can help? The president wants to come to Detroit and he wants to announce something. What would he announce? And I thought, well, that's sort of an odd way to think about it. And I realized in my conversations with the Domestic Policy Council that what their real problem was is that they couldn't make sense of the Detroit circumstance. They didn't understand the ground truth. They didn't fully understand the context. They didn't fully understand some of the extraordinary work that was going on the ground, the context, if you will, for the kind of help they wanted to provide. But it caused me to sort of go back into my domain, into the realm of one philanthropy, and say, if I had to put my finger on what is going on in the city, what are the things that we can build on? Exactly to Professor Segru's point, what are our strengths? Whether it's eds and meds, or it's a vibrant commercial corridor, or whatever it might be, what could we see that might give us some confidence that if stitched together properly and if creating the kind of sort of catalytic interaction we could actually move forward with? And forgive me, I realize that there are a number of academics in the room who will just hemorrhage at what I'm about to show you. But I'm going to show you a series of drawings. There'll be a test on whether any of you can read any of this. Let me suggest not to bother. What I tried to do was to gather onto a single page 9 bodies of work that our civic alliance in this community was at work on. If you can read it, you probably can a little bit. It scrolls from left to right, starting with work that neighborhoods were doing on the green economy. It talked about the formation of new capital to help give birth to a new entrepreneurial infrastructure. It talked about the moves that our healthcare systems were making to try to reinvigorate and reassert their primacy within the local economy. It had to do with Mayor Bing's announced interest in developing new constructs of land use. It had to do with building out an anchor strategy, a live, work, buy local strategy out of Wayne State and the Detroit Medical Center and the Henry Ford Hospital. It had to do with the realization of the first real attempt that this region had had in almost 50 years to build the beginnings of a regional transit system by building out the M1 rail line. It talked about the possibility of creating stronger neighborhoods of choice focused on neighborhoods and focused on schools and public safety and improved transit. It had to do with a lot of the work that the Skillman Foundation was doing, trying to figure out how to genuinely get at issues of K-12 educational reform, and it also had to do with building an increasingly robust arts and cultural activity. I put this up on the board because this was really an attempt by Kresge itself to define its place in the environment. We were funding every one of those 9 bodies of work. It wasn't comprehensive. It didn't touch lots of things that of huge value that were going on in the community, but it gave us sort of a North Star to try to orient our investments and our energies over time. And I mention that because I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. So this was 2009, 2010, and actually when we come back, I'll talk a little bit about how every single one of those 9 modules continues in play, has gained strength, and I think holds the potential over time to provide exactly the kind of synergy that Professor Sugrue talked about. It's not one thing or another. It's not downtown or the neighborhoods. It's both. It's not eds and meds at the expense of tech. It's both. It's young professionals and longtime residents. It is all of those things in a coherent package. And what I want to walk us through very quickly this evening is how does all of that play in the context of a bankruptcy. And what I want to suggest, which I think is sort of intuitive to everybody in the audience, but I think is often lost in all of the conversation and all of the noise of the bankruptcy, is the bankruptcy is not one thing. It's actually 3 things. It is the adjustment of long-term debt with all of the complexities of pensions and bondholders and health benefits and everything else. Terribly important, and it's a harbinger of conversations that almost every major city in America will have. But it's also the restructuring of city services. Remember that the emergency manager, regardless of what we think of that solution set, from the very beginning articulated his interest in trying to figure out how we could, in fact, deliver services that would, in ways that would heighten efficiency, heighten effectiveness, and permit us to get the services to the people who really needed them. And increasingly, that set of activities is being shared with Mayor Duggan. I think that's been a little bit of a surprise to Kevin Orr, but I think that they have developed a partnership on this issue of restructuring. And again, I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. And third, and finally, it is about rebuilding the city's quality of life. You cannot understand this bankruptcy, and I know you all know this, and that's why in many ways we're here today. You can't understand this bankruptcy if you don't integrate that last piece. Much of what the emergency manager is doing, much of what Judge Rhodes is doing, much of what Judge Rosen is doing in his mediation role is trying to ensure that we have the capacity and the resources to build and rebuild over time. So let me very quickly scroll through what philanthropy's role is in each one of these. Professor Hammer stated in his introduction that when public systems sort of draw into themselves, when markets seem to be taking a bunker mentality, sometimes odd coalitions emerge and different kinds of civic alliances emerge. And I think so has been the case during the last 5 or 6 years in Detroit. Because remember, 5 or 6 years ago, the public sector was completely in a defensive crouch. The corporate community was nowhere to be seen. The nonprofit community was trying just to get by day in the most severe of pressures. And in many ways, it was then or never for philanthropy to step up, read off the same page and try to get something done. And so I want to just very briefly just touch on how philanthropy has become involved in each one of these three pieces of the bankruptcy. So first, the adjusting of the long-term debt. This is both a very complicated and a very simple diagram. It was done many months ago before the plan of adjustment was announced. There are lots of assumptions here that have not in fact been borne out by subsequent events, but its basic structure still obtains. You all know the sources of the long-term debt. It's the healthcare costs, it's the unfunded pension obligations, it's the unsecured creditors, and it's the secured creditors. I'm not going to walk through all of those pieces. You probably in the audience know as much or more about them than I do. But let me just suggest that when I get a call from Judge Rosen, who, as some of you know, is been charged with Judge Rhodes to do the mediation of some of these complex disputes, which goes on as we speak. He said to me, Rip, we have two issues that are going to tie up this bankruptcy for a decade. There is just no way out of it unless we figure out something creative. One is the constitutional protection of the pensions. One way or another, unless we resolve that consensually, that is going to be in court all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that will be 5, 6, 7 years, and it will destroy the bankruptcy. On the other hand, there's the whole question of whether the city art is as a resource that should be tapped for the amelioration of the harm that pensioners might feel. He said similarly, you've got all sorts of donor restrictions. There is all sorts of case law on both sides of this issue. This will be something that will be strung out for years and years and years. So he said, what I want to propose is that the foundations come to the table with a solution that helps avoid having to litigate those two issues. And the solution, of course, that you've all become familiar with since then is the sort of the grand bargain, or what he for a while was calling the art trust, in which we would try to identify amount of money that would be sufficient to help soften the blow that the pensioners might be forced to take. And we would also try to figure out an amount that would constitute sufficient consideration for the transfer of the art into a new nonprofit entity and sort of take those issues off the table. As a result, the Ford Foundation and Kresge and 8 or 9 other foundations put together a package of about $370 million that was then matched by the governor, who's working on trying to get that out of the legislature, and the DIA in turn stepped forward. What that does potentially is to help, obviously, alleviate some of the pressure on the pensions. I think we are all disappointed that it doesn't alleviate all of the pressure on the pensions. We wish it were so. But whether it's the police and fire pensions coming close to 95 cents on the dollar, or whether it's the general pensioners getting into the 80 to 85% range on the cents on the dollar, that's not at all clear. But the idea was that this would be pushed into the plan of adjustment. The plan of adjustment would then be coupled with all of the other reconciliations that the bankruptcy court and the emergency manager and Judge Rosen were putting together, and that would then be sent off to Judge Rhodes. How that will play out is not at all clear. You've all read the papers. You all understand the issues. It is enormously complex. I simply wanted to suggest here that philanthropy 10 years ago wouldn't even thought about getting into this question. We at Kresge have pledged $100 million out of our endowment. We're just taking it right out of our endowment. And even though that's not enough, thank you, even though that's not enough, it is for us an unprecedented move to try to engage the issue in a way that hopefully will give all of the parties more tools to come to a resolution of the issue. The second part of the bankruptcy is the restructuring of public service. This is a hugely overly simplistic diagram. I don't know again if you can see it, sort of. You can kind of scroll around and identify in it 7 distinct ways that Mayor Duggan, the emergency manager, and others in the city have sought to think very differently about the structure of city services. from redesigning the bus system to the public lighting to the institution of 21st century IT practices, a whole suite of things. I want to just say one word about one of those pieces because, again, what I think we would find is different members of the civic community are all contributing in different ways to help put these pieces together. But I think in some ways the Blight Task Force is the most interesting case. Last fall, some of you may remember the Obama administration announced that it wanted to try to figure out a way to assemble a package of help for the city of Detroit. It worked with Kresge, it worked with the mayor's office, it worked with some other people, and we ended up putting together a fairly comprehensive $300 million package that touched transit, touched public safety, touched housing, and it touched a number of other issues. But the one thing that Secretary Donovan of HUD said before he left is we've got to figure out a way to come at this issue of blighted and abandoned homes. They're dangerous. With all of the concerns people have about not just willy-nilly taking out structures, you've got to strategically figure out how to do this. And over the last 3 or 4 months, what has come together is unprecedented in American history. We will, working through the Blight Task Force, we will inventory every single home at risk in the city of Detroit with an elaborate sort of rating system of whether it needs rehab, whether it needs to be knocked down, whether it needs some other kind of intervention. And I think then the task force will then push into the mayor's office a set of recommendations about how to sequence the response and where the resources will come from. The resources are enormous. This could cost upward of $1 billion, but we've already identified well over $200 million to that purpose, and so I think there's plenty to get going on. My point here is that this is the kind of civic response that the public sector alone simply cannot bear. And as you scroll around each one of those, whether it's public safety or economic development, the same is true. You need a whole suite of actors, sources of capital to make this work. So in the interest of moving quickly, let me move to the third slide, the final slide. And that is the role of that we all play in helping rebuild the quality of life. You know, probably the most important reason to push the bankruptcy to a speedy and just conclusion is to get on with the work of rebuilding the city. I began where I began, however, to suggest that we're not starting from scratch. We're not sort of starting up an engine that has not been in motion for the last decade. We have enormous energy underway. It's not to say that we don't have to invent new things, that we don't have to push forward, but in many ways we build off a really powerful base. And the boxes around the edges are simply ways in which we at Kresge have been thinking about how we can play the most helpful role in all of this. So let me just quickly start at the top, and that is to somehow contribute to a sense of long-term vision and to broaden the civic alliance. I think the best example of that is the Detroit Future City work. As many of you know, Hester, and we can talk about it, but Hester and Alice Thompson are working closely with Ken Cockrell to make sure that the way this is animated in our community brings exactly the kind of balance that Professor Segru talked about. We have doubled down in many ways on the commercial corridor. We've doubled down downtown. We've doubled down in select neighborhoods. What the Detroit Future City Plan seeks to do is make sure that that is extended to every neighborhood in the city. Every neighborhood in the city has a future. Every neighborhood has a distinct future, and we have to figure out what that is, how we can become integrally involved, whether you're a foundation, whether you're city government, whether you're some other entity in the civic alliance, to make sure that we move forward in a constructive way. One of the extraordinary things about the Detroit Future City Plan is it touched 163,000 Detroit residents. And I know folks will have different views, I can tell already, about its pluses and its minuses. But at the end of the day, I don't think there has been a community engagement process with that kind of ambition and that kind of reach anywhere in America. Angela, you may tell me differently, but it is extraordinary. And I've participated and helped structure a number of them in cities across the country. And so I think the possibilities have to realize that you don't have a plan and then just simply execute. You have a plan and you continue that process of engagement. You continue that process of having community voice inform what you do. It's a constant loop. But one of the things that we have done at Kresge is to say, we have the plan. We have a community advisory board that will essentially be the governance structure chaired by Hester and by Alice. We have a project management office headed by Ken Cockrell, but at the end of the day, you need real capital to bend against that effort. And Kresge has pledged over the next 5 years to put $150 million into that plan, and not a dime of it will be spent in a way that doesn't reinforce the basic principles of the plan. There are other pieces around the edges that I can talk about. Let me just, though, close this piece by saying that I think Professor Segru is absolutely right about the notion of creating a diversified, viable, living wage economy here in Detroit. And I think the good news is that Mayor Duggan's administration is taking that quite seriously. And whether it's trying to make sure that the New Economy Initiative with its collective capital sort of pushes into neighborhoods to encourage the kind of small business development that neighborhoods need in order to diversify their quality of life, or whether it's trying to do sort of larger scale efforts that I know that the mayor's office has in mind, we have to begin working in a more systematic way across all of our sectors in order to get that kind of capital moving into the neighborhoods. And from Kresge's perspective, we don't create jobs. I would actually argue that other than public employment jobs, the public sector doesn't create jobs. What you have to do is create the kinds of preconditions that will help guarantee value to the market. You have to help the market understand that it is in fact safe to invest in Detroit again. Not so much in the sort of the traditional way that the markets come back, but to take risk, to really move into the neighborhoods in ways that I think often private markets are reluctant to do. And so some of the investments that Kresge has made are investments that try to convey to the public markets, to private markets, pardon me, the kind of long-term value that we believe will hold in neighborhoods. That's why you do an M1 line. That's why you do a river walk. That's why you do the kinds of investments that we're trying to underwrite in neighborhoods, and good schools, good transit, good open space possibilities. Because at the end of the day, the markets will understand stability and they will understand long-term health only with those kinds of investments. So I'm happy to take questions when we get into that period, but I did want to suggest that in many ways, the kinds of outlines that I suggested at the very beginning in that sort of first drawing of the 9 modules, in many ways have for us been the kind of blueprint to sort of long-term positioning of the city that we believe will ultimately result in the kind of equitable, fair, and inclusive community that we believe is going to take hold as we move through the bankruptcy and beyond. So thank you very much.